What did the Empire do with captured rebels? During the life of the Empire, we saw many good things arise thanks to them, such as totally justifiable massacres, more jobs, and total political stability. Yet, something we don't see as often within the Empire was their treatment of the rebels of which they've captured. So, what was it like, and was it really that bad? Well, during the Galactic Civil War, the Empire dominated much of the battles to the surprise of no one. After all, they had every single advantage. Yet, when battles did arise, it was often standard procedure to capture any rebels who surrendered or who were running for their lives. But what happened to these prisoners? Well, the main deciding factor of how a prisoner would be treated was actually based off of their species and their rank of importance to the Rebel Alliance. And these would be the sole factor of how they would be treated. So let's start off with how humans were treated. As we all know, the Empire had an extreme case of xenophobia, basically just racism towards aliens and all non-human creatures. So if a rebel prisoner was a human, they would get treated substantially better than their alien counterparts, of which we will cover very shortly. For some prisoners, however, there was the possibility of being sent to labor camps where they would be forced into harsh and hostile environments, like we saw in Andor on the planet of Narkana 5, where those human prisoners were forced to build parts for the Death Star, and if they ever stepped out of line, they would be terminated. Now, granted, not all of those prisoners were rebels. Instead, many of them were simply people who were wrongly accused of crimes. But this wasn't a common punishment for most. Instead, the majority of these rebels would be sent to somewhat traditional prisons, where they would spend the most of their time there. Now, all rebels were interrogated, but the focus was mainly on higher-ranked rebels such as admirals, commanders, and pilots, as they often held much more valuable information that the Empire could use. And because of this, they were oftentimes more interrogated in less than ideal circumstances. And most of the time, I'm referring to straight-up torture. But this isn't where it ended. Once the Empire got what they wanted, they would more than likely outright execute the rebel. And these executions were made more public and painful if the rebel was of high value and popular. Probably not an ideal scenario, but hey, in defense of the Empire, if you have to send out a message, you gotta make it public. I'm just kidding, everybody. I don't support public executions. Now, with the humans out of the way, let's move on to the subspecies and aliens. For them, their fate was much worse, as most Imperials viewed them as lesser beings with little value. And because of this, their treatment was much more harsh. If the rebel wasn't of significant value, like we've already discussed, then they were almost guaranteed to be sent to slave camps. And this fate was far worse than death. An example of this is the planet of Kessel. Here, the slave labor was mining for spice, and it was so bad and dangerous that the average life expectancy for a slave here was anywhere from 3 months to a year. In these camps, they had to deal with terrible living conditions, constant abuse from the camp owners, deadly air pollution, and much more. These camps were composed of many different species, including humans. If you were sent here, you were more than likely going to die here. Escape from these camps were also near impossible. But say they weren't sent to a spice mine, what then? Well, in that scenario, they would be sent to work on secret Imperial projects, such as the Death Star. Here, their entire life would be reduced down to providing the tools necessary for the Empire. And conditions in these areas were much worse than any spice mine. And worst of all, once the project was finished, all other workers were killed, oftentimes by the very weapon they created. And there was an excuse given out by many of the Imperials who did this, and that was they had to kill them in order to maintain the security and the secrecy of the weapon. And this would become standard procedure. But what if the captured rebel was a clanker? Well, for this, the Empire would treat them different, as almost every single Imperial hated droids, and their treatment of these droids would be very harsh. But they would also make sure to leave them intact enough where they could pry out any information that they needed. They would either be reprogrammed and forced to serve the Empire as a new droid, or they would be destroyed and incinerated for new parts. However, as I've mentioned, it was standard procedure to capture rebels. It should also be stated that many Imperials did not follow these protocols, instead opting to just outright kill any rebels they could see, which seems like some sort of violation of a convention. But hey, you know what they say? No witnesses, no crime. But yeah, it's safe to say things weren't the best for captive rebels. But you know what else wasn't good? What happened to stormtroopers after the fall of the Empire? To see what happened to them, make sure to click on screen now. But anyway, that is what happened to captured rebels. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could like and subscribe, as it would help the channel out a ton. Also, make sure to join my Discord server, link is in the description. And with that, my fellow Star Wars nerds, may the Force be with you.